Jake loved solo camping. He wasn't scared of being alone in the wilderness. In fact, he enjoyed it. The quiet, the fresh air, the feeling of being completely away from the world, it gave him peace. This time, he picked a spot deep in the Appalachian Mountains, far from any hiking trails. He wanted complete solitude. He packed light but made sure he had all the essentials: a tent, food, water, a flashlight, and a knife. It was supposed to be a peaceful weekend. The first night. The first day went by smoothly. He set up his tent near a small clearing, gathered some firewood, and cooked a simple meal. As night fell, the temperature dropped and a chilly breeze rustled the trees. Jake sat by his fire listening to the crickets. He felt completely at home. After finishing his meal, he crawled into his tent and zipped up the entrance. He checked his phone, no signal as expected, but that was part of the adventure. He set an alarm for sunrise, rolled into his sleeping bag, and drifted into sleep. A few hours later, he woke up. Something wasn't right. His ears picked up a sound, whispering. It was soft, almost like the wind, but there were words in it. He held his breath, trying to make out what was being said, but it was too faint. He reached for his flashlight and turned it on. The bright beam cut through the darkness as he slowly unzipped the tent. He peeked outside. Nothing. Just the trees and the soft flicker of his dying fire. The sound had stopped. Telling himself it was just his imagination, he went back inside and forced himself to sleep. The next morning, Jake brushed off the weird experience. He spent the day exploring the area, climbing a few rocky slopes, and taking pictures of the breathtaking views. Everything felt normal, peaceful. As the sun started to set, he returned to his campsite, made another fire, and cooked his meal. The warmth of the flames made him feel safe, but the moment he stepped into his tent, the unease returned. It was the same feeling he had the night before, as if something was just beyond his vision. He shook his head and laughed to himself. "I'm acting like a scared kid," he muttered. But that night, the whispers returned. This time, they were louder, closer. They didn't sound like the wind anymore. They were all around his tent. Soft, murmuring voices rising and falling, like a conversation he wasn't supposed to hear. The words were still unclear, but they felt wrong. Jake sat up, gripping his knife. His heart pounded in his chest. He had camped in remote places before, but this was different. This felt like something was toying with him. After what felt like forever, the whispers stopped. The forest was silent. By morning, he had convinced himself it was all in his head. But when he stepped outside, his stomach twisted. There were footprints around his tent, small, twisted shapes, almost like tiny hands pressed into the dirt. The tracks circled his tent in a perfect ring. Jake snapped a picture with his phone, though he had no signal to send it anywhere. He stared at the prints, trying to make sense of them. Maybe a prank? But he was miles away from the nearest town. No one knew he was here. That night, he built his fire bigger than before. He wanted light, he wanted warmth, but most of all, he wanted whatever was out there to stay away. As the fire crackled, the fog rolled in, thick, heavy, swallowing the trees, and then came the whispers. This time, he could hear them clearly. Soft, childlike voices giggling, whispering his name, Jake. His blood turned to ice. He grabbed his flashlight and knife, stepping out of the tent. The fog was everywhere, making it impossible to see beyond a few feet. He shined the light around, trying to catch movement. Then, something pressed against his tent from the outside. A shape, small, but pushing against the fabric, stretching it inward. Jake spun around, light shaking in his hands. "Who's there?" Silence. Then, a low giggle. His breath caught in his throat. He turned to grab his bag, but when he looked back at the tent, it was different. The fire pit was gone, his backpack was moved, his supplies were rearranged in strange patterns on the ground, and his tent, it was now in the middle of a circle of stones, symbols drawn in the dirt around it. His hands shook as he packed his things. He needed to leave now, but as he tried to find his way back, the fog thickened. His GPS wouldn't work. His footprints disappeared behind him. The whispers followed, growing louder, laughing. Then he saw them, figures in the mist. Small, hunched shapes with glowing eyes watching him. Jake ran. Branches tore at his face, but he didn't stop. The whispers turned to shrill laughter. His lungs burned. He stumbled into a clearing. The fog lifted, and in the distance, his car. He didn't question it. He didn't look back. He jumped in, started the engine, and sped away. Days later, he checked his phone. The picture of the footprints was still there, but now there was something else in the image. A pair of glowing eyes, staring at him from the tree line. I had always been a fan of solitude, of the great outdoors, of the feeling that came with being surrounded by nothing but towering trees and the whispering wind. That was why, when I finally got a break from work, I decided to go on a solo camping trip deep into the Oregon wilderness. I had done my research, picked a lesser-known trail that led to an isolated clearing near a serene lake. No cell service, no crowded campsites, just pure, undisturbed nature. It was perfect, or at least I thought it was. I reached the spot just before dusk, set up my tent and built a small fire. The forest around me was was eerily quiet, but that was expected. The deeper you went, the less wildlife you encountered, at least that's what I told myself. The first night was uneventful. I cooked some canned beans, listened to the crackling fire, and admired the sky full of stars. It was the kind of peace I had been craving. But then, as I was about to fall asleep, I heard something, a soft rustling sound, not the wind, not an animal scurrying through leaves, but something deliberate, a step. I sat up, listening carefully. Telling myself it was my imagination, I lay back down and eventually drifted off. The next morning, I woke up feeling uneasy, but I brushed it off and went about my day, fishing by the lake, gathering firewood, and exploring the surroundings. The forest felt different though, too quiet, as if it were holding its breath. Later that evening, while preparing dinner, I noticed something odd. My backpack had been unzipped. I could have sworn I had zipped it up the night before. Maybe I had been careless. But then I found my flashlight a few feet away from where I had left it. Someone or something had been near my campsite. That night, I made sure to keep my hunting knife close. As I lay in my tent, sleep didn't come easily. Then, just past midnight, I heard it again. I held my breath, gripping my knife, listening. The steps stopped right outside my tent. Then, something dragged across the fabric of the tent. Slow and deliberate. I wanted to call out, but fear had latched onto my throat. Instead, I remained still, forcing myself to breathe silently. Minutes passed, agonizing, endless minutes, until finally, whatever it was walked away. I barely slept after that. Determined to leave, I packed up my belongings at first light. But as I stepped outside, I noticed something that sent a chill down my spine. Carved into a nearby tree was a symbol, 3 interlocking circles with a long, jagged line running through them. I had never seen anything like it before, and worse, there were more of them. Dozens of trees around my campsite had been marked overnight. I didn't waste another second. I slung my backpack over my shoulder and began the hike back. But the deeper I went into the woods, the more symbols I found, as if they had been carved specifically to lead me somewhere. Panic set in. I wasn't alone. Someone had been watching me. Then I heard it again, footsteps, but this time they were running. I bolted, crashing through the undergrowth, my breath ragged. The footsteps followed, closing in. I dared not look back, but I could feel something behind me, something fast. Just as I thought I couldn't run anymore, I spotted my car in the distance. Summoning every ounce of strength, I sprinted, threw myself inside, and locked the doors. The forest, the thing, whatever it was, it had stopped at the tree line. I could feel it staring, hidden behind the trunks, just out of sight. I didn't wait to find out more. I turned the key, tires skidding against the dirt, and sped away, never looking back. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? A man alone in the woods, terrified by footsteps and strange symbols. But I know what I saw, I know what I felt. A few months later, curiosity got the better of me, and I searched for similar encounters in that area. What I found chilled me to the bone. Hikers had gone missing on that trail, their campsites abandoned, gear left behind. The common detail, the same strange symbols carved into trees. I don't know who or what was out there that night, but I do know one thing: I will never go camping alone again.